Everyone has already noticed how incredible Replaced is, and playing it for the first time truly feels like being inside a classic sci-fi movie brought to life. But behind this fantastic art and jaw-dropping scenery, there is a brutal world that does not forgive mistakes. If you've made it past the initial missions, you probably noticed that surviving the streets of Phoenix City requires quick reflexes and a much deeper understanding of how enemies behave. After spending days exploring every alley and testing all the limits of combat, I've discovered some tricks that completely change the tide of things and that the tutorial simply forgets to mention. So grab your gear and get ready, because here are 10 advanced tips you need to know to master Replaced. You know that moment when an indie game surprises you by delivering combat worthy of a big-budget action title? That's exactly what happens with Replaced's fighting system. Since my first few hours with the title, I haven't been able to stop calling its combat Arkham in 2.5D, because the inspiration from the Batman series is clear and wonderfully executed from this perspective. It's not just about frantically mashing buttons, but entering an almost hypnotic rhythm where every attacking and defending movement flows in a very natural and cinematic way. The golden rule here to avoid struggling is to master the rhythm-based parry and counterattack. You will notice during fights that the game dictates the flow of encounters through very specific visual icons that appear above the enemies' heads. When a yellow alert flashes on the screen, that is your exact cue to press the block button, performing a perfect parry, and breaking the opponent's guard. On the other hand, if the icon turns red, forget about defending immediately, as this is an unblockable attack and your only option for survival is to perform a quick dodge out of danger. What makes this mechanic so addictive is how it actively rewards your precision and cool-headedness. Instead of interrupting the fluidity of the battle, landing these defenses perfectly on time keeps you in the center of the action and helps build your energy bar quickly. It is precisely with this energy accumulated by punishing enemies that you can unleash powerful shots from your gun and trigger extremely stylish and violent finisher animations. If you try to be too aggressive and ignore the colors, groups of thugs will surround you and punish you severely. Therefore, my biggest recommendation is that you treat every encounter with thugs in this dystopian world as a strategic dance. Take a deep breath, observe the yellow and red attack patterns, and let the combat system dictate the right moment to act. When the rhythm of this Arkham in 2.5D finally clicks in your head, facing hordes of enemies will stop being a tense moment and turn into the most satisfying and brilliant part of your entire experience playing Replaced. Replaced is one of those games that uses every inch of the scenery as an active part of your survival, and the 2.5D depth system is probably the most underutilized element by most players in the first few hours. A lot of people treat movement between planes as a pretty visual detail, but in practice, it's a complete strategic tool that changes the dynamics of each encounter. When I realized this, I started seeing each arena not as a straight line of confrontation, but as a three-dimensional space full of possibilities. The smartest use of this depth is flanking. When you face a group of enemies positioned at a specific point, going in head-on is almost always the worst possible choice. Moving reach to a different plane of the scenery allows you to appear in the opponent's blind spot, breaking their formation before even trading the first blow. This type of approach not only causes confusion among the enemies, but also completely resets the fight's positioning in your favor. Fleeing and escaping also work much more efficiently when you use the planes of the environment. In chases or when you're overwhelmed by numbers, trying to run away on the same line as the enemies rarely works. Switching planes at the right time creates a visual and spatial separation that disrupts the pursuit's rhythm and gives you those precious seconds to breathe, reposition, and plan the next move. What I like most about this mechanic is how it forces you to treat the scenery as an active character in the fight and not just a backdrop. Hidden shortcuts in the further planes, cover that only exists at certain depths, and angles that only appear when you move laterally through space make Replaced a game that rewards those who stop and observe the environment before acting. Playing in a straight line here is not just inefficient, it's practically ignoring half the tools the game put in your hands. Replaced has many combat systems to master, but managing the kinetic energy of the Huxley gun is undoubtedly what separates players who merely survive from those who truly dominate the encounters. This combat loop is so central to the game that once you truly understand it, everything starts to make sense in a way that almost feels obvious. The Huxley is not just a weapon, it is the heart of your fighting style. It alternates between two distinct modes, the baton for melee combat and the fire mode for ranged attacks. What many people don't realize right away is that these two modes aren't independent of each other. They form an inseparable loop. Every baton strike you connect on an enemy is, in practice, charging the gun's kinetic energy meter, setting the stage for the next shot or finisher. When the meter is full, it's time to pull the trigger and use the high damage shot or trigger those cinematic finisher animations that make the game look like an action movie. This is the give and take cycle that defines every encounter. You go in with the baton, accumulate energy, and unleash a devastating blow. Standing still or retreating too much breaks this rhythm and drains your meter quickly, turning the Huxley into a much less efficient weapon and leaving you vulnerable. The practical tip here is simple. Never stop being aggressive with melee, even when your health is low. The game was designed to reward those who keep up constant pressure, and entering this flow of physical attack followed by a powerful shot creates a cadence that feels extremely satisfying. Think of the baton as your investment and the shot as your dividend, and you will never want to waste a single free swing. One of the things that made me enjoy the combat the most is how the dodge roll isn't just for escaping danger. It's for commanding the space of the fight. To me, this is the kind of mechanic that completely changes how you view an encounter, because rolling stops being a panic button and becomes a control tool. Instead of just reacting, you start using the roll to choose where the fight will take place. This becomes even more important when enemies start pressuring you in closed environments. In those moments, trying to brute force your way out is exactly what the game wants you to avoid, because standing still or insisting on trading blows in the same spot is usually a recipe for getting cornered. I like to think that the role in Replaced is almost a way of taking a breath inside combat. You step out of the line of attack, reposition, reread the scene, and return better placed to respond. And there's another detail I think is essential. The roll is the best answer against those attacks that simply weren't meant to be faced head on. When the game pushes you into a moment where defending isn't enough, rolling becomes the smartest and also the most stylish way out. That's why I see this mechanic much more as an offensive move than just defense, because often the best play isn't avoiding the hit, but escaping it already thinking about the counterattack and the new angle of the fight. The dodge roll is what keeps you from becoming an easy target when the arena is small and enemies start surrounding you. When you understand this, the combat becomes much more beautiful to play, because every roll stops looking like an escape and starts looking like total mastery of the situation. One thing the developers never hid is that the combat was built to be visceral and fluid right from the game's first draft. But what a lot of people don't realize right away is that there's a hidden momentum system behind all this fluidity, and it completely changes the pace of the experience. When you start landing consecutive hits without interruption, Reach's animations become visibly faster and more aggressive, as if the character enters a state of total focus. This is the secret the devs mention so much when talking about the combat's flow. It's not just an aesthetic matter of looking prettier on screen. It's a real and measurable mechanical advantage. Maintaining the rhythm of attacks without long pauses between them speeds up your animations and increases your overall efficiency in the fight, which means you can deal more damage in less time and get out of tough encounters with much more control than you thought possible. The problem is that most players break this flow exactly when they shouldn't, backing off to take a breath, waiting for the enemy to come to you, or hesitating before jumping into a group of thugs. I made this mistake many times early on and paid the price with fights that were much slower and more dragged out than they needed to be. When I stopped hesitating and started treating each encounter as a continuous sequence of movements, the difference was immediate and stark. The mindset that works here is simple. Reach needs to constantly be in motion. It doesn't matter if it's 2 enemies or 8. Flow is your greatest ally, and any unnecessary pause is a betrayal of the very combat system the game was designed to offer. When you enter this state of uninterrupted rhythm, Replaced stops being just a beautiful game to look at, and becomes one of the most satisfying combat experiences you'll have in a 2D platformer in recent years. Replaced doesn't take long to introduce you to the game's most frustrating enemies, and the armored termite grunts are exactly the kind of obstacle that will make you waste a lot of energy for nothing if you don't understand how they work from the start. I learned the hard way. I spent a lot of time hitting the wrong spot, watching my kinetic energy meter deplete without causing any real damage. When I finally understood the role of the enhanced pickaxe in these situations, it felt like the game had unlocked a whole layer of strategy I had been ignoring. The rule here is straightforward. First and foremost, the armor needs to be broken. Termite grunts and brutes were designed to absorb your normal hits without even blinking, and insisting on attacking without first using the enhanced pickaxe on the B button is literally wasting resources. The enhanced pickaxe is the only way to break through these enemies' defenses and open the window where real damage finally begins to be applied. Treating this step as mandatory before any combo completely changes the outcome of the encounter. What makes this even more important is the context of mixed groups. When you are surrounded by regular enemies and a termite grunt at the same time, the natural temptation is to focus on the easier ones first, to keep the combat flow going. But letting the armored grunt roam freely while you deal with the others is a recipe for taking a heavy hit at the wrong time. I always prioritize breaking the brute's armor first, even if it means briefly pausing the pace of the fight, because the threat he poses while armored is too great to ignore. Think of the termite grunts as a constant reminder that Replaced doesn't want you to use a single strategy for all enemies. The game forces you to read each situation, identify the right threat, and adapt your toolkit before entering aggressive mode. The enhanced pickaxe exists exactly for this, and when you incorporate using it as a first reflex upon seeing armor on the field, these enemies stop being a problem and become just another piece of the combat loop you already master. Phoenix City was built with impressive visual and spatial density, and the game uses this wealth of detail to hide upgrades that make a real difference in your gameplay. When I started to slow down and pay attention to the less obvious corners of the scenery, I was surprised by the amount of upgrades I had left behind in the first few hours. The progression system here works like a discreet but genuinely rewarding RPG light. Carefully exploring the environments of Phoenix City will reveal health upgrades, additional stims, expansions to the Huxley's capacity, and overdrive upgrades that progressively transform Reach into a more powerful fighter. None of these items will appear automatically on your main path. They exist precisely for those who decide to step off the obvious route and carefully investigate every corridor, every platform, and every side area. What I find smartest about this approach is how it perfectly fits the tone of the game. Replaced doesn't bombard you with constant upgrade menus or progression screens, so when you find a hidden upgrade in a corner of Phoenix City, the reward feels much more organic and satisfying than in a traditional RPG. Each upgrade found feels like a genuine bonus you earned for being curious and observant, not something the game automatically dropped in your lap. Never pass through an area without first checking if there's an alternative path you haven't taken yet. Huxley capacity upgrades, in particular, are the ones I miss the most when I don't grab them, because they directly expand the combat loop you already know. Phoenix City rewards those who treat exploration as part of the experience, and not just a pause between story cutscenes, and the benefits accumulated throughout the game make all the difference in the more demanding encounters to come. Chase scenes are, without exaggeration, some of the most tense and adrenaline-fueled moments a 2D platformer can offer nowadays. It's not that kind of artificial tension where the game gives you room to mess up 2 or 3 times before punishing you. It's real tension where a single misstep means an instant game over. When I faced the first escape sequences against drones and cops, I was genuinely surprised by the level of precision the game demands without any prior warning. What makes these sequences so relentless is that the timing of every jump and dodge must be calculated in fractions of a second. Replaced doesn't offer generous reaction windows in these moments. It expects you to read the obstacle, process the distance, and execute the move almost simultaneously. Drones, cops, and termites in pursuit mode move fast enough that any hesitation or wrong anticipation results in immediate capture. It's the kind of challenge that seems unfair the first time and absolutely fair by the 5th when you finally memorized the pattern. The key to surviving these scenes is to stop trying to improvise and start treating each escape sequence like a choreography. Every obstacle has an exact moment to be jumped over, every drone has a predictable route, and every corridor has a specific timing the game wants you to learn. When I started viewing deaths not as frustrations but as lessons about the chase's layout, my success rate improved drastically. Muscle memory here is as important as any combat skill. Here is what I do: breathe before each attempt and resist the temptation to press buttons faster than the situation requires. The most common mistake at these times is excess anxiety, which makes you jump too early or dodge at the wrong moment out of pure nervousness. Replaced punishes rushing just as much as it punishes slowness, and the escape scenes are the most brutal and thrilling reminder that this game was made for those who have the patience to learn and the courage to execute at the right moment. One of the things that impressed me the most in Replaced was discovering that Warren's movement wasn't designed just to get you from point A to point B in the environment. It was designed to be an active part of your offensive arsenal. Most players learn to run, learn to stop, and learn to attack as three separate actions. But when you start combining these three things into an intentional sequence, it opens up a range of possibilities that completely changes how you approach each encounter. This was one of the most satisfying discoveries I had with the game's combat. The core trick here is simple in theory, but powerful in practice. Run towards the enemy and stop abruptly right before attacking. This move makes Warren perform an automatic leap that covers a surprising distance and connects the hit on enemies that would normally be out of reach. In boss battles, this technique is particularly valuable because it allows you to get into the damage zone, land a hit, and immediately create separation before the boss responds, keeping the combo active without having to absorb unnecessary punishment. What truly redefines this mechanic is understanding that the dodge doesn't just exist for defense in this context. It is the natural extension of this offensive cycle. After using the running leap to connect a ranged blow, the dodge acts as the exit that preserves your momentum and repositions you for the next entry. Using space, actively creating distance, and covering it again quickly with the leap makes Warren seem much more agile and unpredictable than any enemy can keep up with. For me, this tip represents the core combat philosophy that Replaced wants to teach throughout the experience. Standing still is the biggest mistake you can make. The game rewards those who turn every action, including the simple act of running and braking, into part of a continuous offensive cadence. When movement becomes a weapon, you don't just survive better, you start playing with an elegance that makes every encounter feel choreographed and completely under your control. Replaced is the type of game that hides valuable information in every corner of the environment, and the White Flash's scanning system is probably the most underestimated feature by those who play without paying attention to the visual details of the scenery. I myself spent a good amount of time ignoring these white shines in the early hours, treating them as purely aesthetic within the already dense and impressive art direction of Phoenix City. When I finally stopped to press E on one of them and opened the journal with Jay, I realized I had missed an absurd amount of context and useful information. What makes the system so powerful is the variety of what it delivers. Some scans reveal direct hints about combat mechanics and progression that the game never explicitly explains in tutorials. Others deepen the lore of the dystopian world Replaced has built with such, and some even go as far as offering solutions for environmental puzzles you might have gotten stuck on without understanding exactly what the game was asking for. It's a system that rewards curiosity in completely different ways depending on what you scan. The journal on the J key is where all this truly comes to life. It acts as an organized repository of everything you've collected through scans, and revisiting it regularly is a habit that makes a real difference in your understanding of the game. I started opening the journal whenever I got stuck on a puzzle or felt I was missing some combat nuance, and surprisingly, I found answers there I didn't even know I needed. The game literally gives you the tools to understand it better, but only if you stop to look for them. Replaced has a rich narrative and a world system built with great attention to detail. And a large part of that depth is only accessible to those who actively interact with the environment. Ignoring the white flashes is like watching an amazing movie with half the audio turned off. The experience still works, but you are definitely missing something that was placed there on purpose to enrich everything.